Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. What a wonderful life it is for the Hollister family. They wake up to the birds' vibrant dawn chorus, enjoy the fresh country air, and can watch the sunset at night, all from the comfortable, homey stone barn. Sidney Graham and his sister are frequent guests at the barn, and even the fashionable Mrs. Graham is charmed by the intrepid little family. Shirley gives herself a good talking to, in order to make sure she doesn't read anything but kindliness in her growing friendship with her handsome landlord. This is a beautiful and peaceful time for the Hollisters. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 13. It was beautiful to wake the next morning with the birds singing in the trees, and a wonderful Sabbath quiet over everything. Tired out as she was, and worn with excitement and care, Shirley was the first to waken, and she lay there quiet beside Carol for a little while with her eyes closed, listening and saying a prayer of thanksgiving for the peace of the place, and the wonder that it had come into her life. Then suddenly a strange luminousness about her simply forced her to open her eyes. The eastern window was across the room from her bed, and the sky was rosy with the dawn and flooding the room. It was the first time in years that she had watched the sunrise. She had almost forgotten in the little dark city house that there was a sun to rise and make things glorious. The sun had seemed an enemy to burn and wilt and stifle. But now here he was a friend, a radiant new friend, to be waited for and enjoyed, to give glory to all their lives. She raised herself on one elbow and watched until the red ball had risen and burst into the brightness of day. Then she lay down softly again and listened to the birds. They seemed to be mad with joy over the new day. Presently the chorus grew less and less. The birds had gone about their morning tasks, and only a single bright song, now and then from some soloist in the big tree overhead, marked the sweet-scented silence of the morning. In the quiet, Shirley lay and went over the events since she had first seen this place and taken the idea of living in the barn. Her heart gave thanks and knew that her mother had not disliked it as she had feared. There was no sense that it was a stable, no odor of living creatures having occupied it before, only sweet dusty clover, like a lingering of past things put away carefully. It was like a great camping expedition, and then all those flowers! The scent of the lilies was on the air. How lovely of the young girl out of her luxury to think to pass on some of the sweet things of life, and the gracious, chivalrous man, her brother. She must not let him think she would presume upon his kindness. She must not even let her thoughts cross that line and dwell on the ground of social equality. She knew where he belonged, and there he should stay for her. She was heart-free and happy, and only too glad to have such a kind landlord. She drifted off to sleep again, and it was late when she awoke the next time. A silvery bell from the little white church in the valley was ringing and echoing distantly. Sabbath, real Sabbath, seemed brooding happily in the very air. Shirley got up and dressed hastily. She felt as if she had already lost too much of this first wonderful day in the country. A thrush was spilling his liquid notes in the tree overhead when she tiptoed softly into her mother's room. Doris opened her eyes and looked in wonder, then whispered softly, "What is that, Shirley? What is that pretty sound?" "A birdie in the tree, dearie," whispered Shirley. "A real birdie? I want to see it. Take Doris up, Shirley." So Shirley lifted the little maiden, wrapped a shawl about her, and carried her softly to the window, where she looked up in wonder and joy. The boys came tumbling down from their loft in a few minutes, and there was no more sleep to be had. Carol was up and out, and the voice of one or the other of them was continually raised in a shout of triumph over some new delight. "I saw a fish in the brook," shouted Harley under his mother's window. "It was only a little fellow, but maybe it'll grow bigger some day, and then we can fish." "You silly," cried George. "It was a minnow. Minnows don't grow to be big. They're only good for bait." "Hush, George. There's a nest in the big tree. I've been watching, and the mother bird is sitting on it. That was the father bird singing a while ago." This from Carol. George, Harley, and Carol declared their intention of going to church. That had likely been the first bell that rang, their mother told them, and they would have plenty of time to get there if they hurried. It was only 9:30. Country churches rang a bell then, and another at 10, and the final bell at 10:30, probably. Possibly they had Sunday school at 10. Anyhow, they could go and find out. It wouldn't matter if they were a little late the first time. So they ate some breakfast in a hurry, took each a sandwich left from the night before, crossed the road, climbed the fence, and went joyously over the green fields to church, thinking how much nicer it was than walking down a brick-paved street, past the same old grimy houses, to a dim, artificially lighted church. Shirley took a survey of the larder, decided that roast chicken, potato croquettes, and peas would all warm up quickly, and, as there was plenty of ice cream left and some cakes, they would fare royally without any work. So she sat beside her mother and told the whole story of her ride, the finding of the barn, her visit to the Graham office, and all that transpired until the present time. The mother listened, watching her child, but said no more of her inner thoughts. If it occurred to her that her oldest daughter was fair to look upon, and that her winning ways were sweet, and she had an unspoiled face and wistful eyes, and if all of that had something to do with the price of their summer's abode, it would be no wonder. But she did not mean to trouble her child further. She would investigate for herself when opportunity offered. So she quieted all anxieties Shirley might have had about her sanction of their selection of a home, kissed Shirley, and told her she felt it in her very bones that she was going to get well right away. And indeed, there was much in the fact of the lifting of the burden of anxiety concerning where they should live that went to brighten the eyes of the invalid and strengthen her heart. When the children came home from church, Shirley was putting the dinner on the table, and her mother was arrayed in a pretty kimono, a relic of their better days, and ready to be helped to the couch and wheeled out to the dining room. It had been pleasant to see the children coming across the green meadow in the distance, and get things all ready for them when they rushed in hungry. Shirley was so happy she felt like crying. After the dinner things were washed, they shoved the couch into the living room among the flowers, where George had built up a beautiful fire, for it was still chilly. The children gathered around their mother and talked, making plans for the summer, telling about the service they had attended, chattering like so many magpies. The mother lay and watched them and was content. Sometimes her eyes would search the dim, mellow rafters overhead, and glance along the stone walls, and she would say to herself, "This is a barn. I am living in a barn. My husband's children have come to this, that they have no place to live but a barn." She was testing herself to see if the thought hurt her, but looking on their happy faces, somehow she could not feel sad. "Children," she said suddenly in one of those little lulls of conversation, "do you realize that Christ was born in a stable? It isn't so bad to live in a barn. We ought to be very thankful for this splendid one." "Oh, Mother dear, it's so beautiful of you to take it that way," cried Shirley with tears in her eyes. "Doris, do you remember the little song about Jesus in the stable?" asked Carol. "Shirley and I will sing it for you." Doris got a little stool and sat up beside her mother's couch. She folded her small hands demurely and listened as her sisters began to sing. Away in a manger, no crib for a bed, the little Lord Jesus laid down his sweet head. The stars in the heavens looked down where he lay, the little Lord Jesus asleep on the hay. The cattle are lowing, the poor baby wakes, but little Lord Jesus no crying he makes. I love thee, Lord Jesus, look down from the sky, and stay by my cradle till morning is nigh. After they had finished, Shirley and Carol each kissed Doris, and then all three girls bent over and kissed their mother's cheek, which was now wet with happy tears. Then all the children began to sing other things, all standing around the piano. By and by that distant bell from the valley called again. "There's a vesper service at 5 o'clock. Why don't you go, Shirley? You and George and Harley," said Carol. "Me want to go too," declared Doris earnestly, and it was finally decided that the walk would not be too long. So the boys, Shirley, and little Doris, even in her chubby legs, started off across the fields, while Carol stayed with her mother. And this time, Mrs. Hollister heard all about Elizabeth and how she wanted Carol to come and see her sometime. Heard, too, about the proposed dance. Heard and looked thoughtful and wondered more. "Mother is afraid they're not quite our kind of people, dear," she said gently. "You mustn't get your heart bound up in that girl. She may be very nice, but she's a society girl, and you're not, you know. It stands to reason she will have other interests pretty soon, and then you'll be disappointed when she forgets all about you." "She won't forget, Mother. I know she won't," declared Carol stoutly. "She's not that kind. She loves me. She told me so. She wanted to put one of her rings on my finger to bind our friendship. Only I wouldn't let her until I had asked you, because I didn't have any but grandmother's to give her, and I couldn't give her that." "That was right, dear. You can't begin things like that. You would find a great many of them, and we haven't the money to keep up with a little girl who's been used to everything." Carol's face went down. Tears began to come in her eyes. "Can't we even have friends?" she said, turning her face away to hide the quiver in her lip and the tears that were rolling down her cheeks. "Yes, dear," said the mother sorrowfully, "but don't choose them from among another people. People who can't possibly have much in common with us. It is sure to hurt hard when there are differences in station like that." "But I didn't choose them. They chose us," declared Carol. "Elizabeth just went wild over us the first time she saw us, and her brother told Shirley he was glad, that it would do Elizabeth a lot of good to know us. He said, 'We've learned a lot of things from you already,' just like that. He said it. I was coming down the stairs behind them when they stood here talking one day, and I couldn't help hearing them." "Yes?" said Mrs. Hollister thoughtfully. "Well, perhaps, but dear, go slow, and don't pin your heart to a friendship like that, for it will most likely be disappointing. Just be happy in what she has done for us already, and don't expect anything more. She may never come again. It may have just been a passing whim, and I don't want you to be always looking for her, and always disappointed." "I shall not be disappointed, Mamma," said Carol decidedly. "You'll see." And her face brightened. Then, as if to make good her words, a big car came whirring up the road and stopped in front of the barn. And almost before she could get to the window to look out, Carol heard Elizabeth's voice calling softly, "Carol, Carol, are you there?" And she flung the door open and rushed into her new friend's arms. Graham came more slowly up the incline, smiling apologetically and hoping he didn't intrude, coming so soon. Carol led them over to the invalid and introduced her friend, and the young man came after them. "I'm afraid this is rather soon to obey your summons, Mrs. Hollister," he said engagingly. "But Elizabeth couldn't stand it without coming over to see if you really found the ice cream freezer. So I thought we'd just drop in for a minute and see whether you were quite comfortable." Somehow, suddenly, Mrs. Hollister's fears and conclusions concerning these two young people began to vanish, and in spite of her, she felt just as Shirley had done, that they were genuine in their kindness and friendship. Carol, watching her, was satisfied, and a glow of triumph shone in her eyes. Nevertheless, Mrs. Hollister gathered her caution about her as a garment, and in dignified and pleasant phrases thanked the two in such a way that they must see that neither she nor her children would ever presume upon what had been done for them, nor take it for any more than a passing kindliness. But to her surprise, the young man did not seem to be more than half listening to her words. He seemed to be studying her face with deep intention that was almost embarrassing. The soft color stole into her thin cheeks, and she stopped speaking and looked at him in dismay. "I beg your pardon," he said, seeing her bewilderment, "but you can't understand, perhaps, how interested I am in you. I'm afraid I have been guilty of staring. You see, it is simply amazing to me to find a woman of your refinement and evident culture and education who is content, I might say even joyful, to live in a barn. I don't know another woman who would be satisfied. And you seem to have brought up all your children with just such happy, adaptable natures that it is a great puzzle to me. Why, I feel sort of rebuked. I feel that you and your children are among the great of the earth. Don't thank Elizabeth and me for the little we have been able to do toward making this barn habitable. It was sort of, I might say, an homage due to you that we were rendering. And now please don't think anything more about it. Let's just talk as if we were friends, that is, if you are willing to accept a couple of humble strangers among your list of friends." "Why, surely, if you put it that way," smiled the little woman, "although I'm sure I don't know what else we could do but be glad and happy over it, that we had a barn like this to come to, under a sweet blue sky with a bird and a tree thrown in, when we literally didn't know where we could afford to lay our heads. You know beggars shouldn't be choosers, but I am sure one would choose a spacious place like this any day, in preference to most of the ordinary city houses, with their tiny dark rooms and small breathless windows." "Even if it was called a barn?" "Even if it was called a barn," said the woman, with a flitting dance in her eyes that reminded him of the girl Shirley. "Well, I'm learning a lot, I tell you," said the young man. "The more I see of you all, the more I learn. It's opened my eyes to a number of things in my life that I'm going to set right. By the way, is Miss Hollister here? I brought over a book I was telling her about the other day. I thought she might like to see it." "She went over to the vesper service at the little church across the fields. They'll be coming home soon, I think. It must be nearly over." He looked at his watch. "Suppose I take the car and bring them back? You stay here, Elizabeth. I'll soon be back. I think I can catch them around by the road if I put on speed." He was off, and the mother lay on the couch watching the two girls and wishing with all her heart that it were so that her children might have these two fine young people for friends. But of course such things could not very well be in this world of stern realities and multitudinous conventionalities. What, for instance, would be said in the social set to which the Grahams belonged if it were known that some of their intimate friends lived in a barn? No, such things did not happen even in books, and the mother lay still and sighed. She heard the chatter of the two girls. "You're coming home with me to stay over Sunday pretty soon. Sidney said he would fix it all up with your mother pretty soon. We'll sleep together and have the grandest times. Mother likes me to have friends stay with me, but most of the girls I know are off at boarding school now, and I'm dreadfully lonesome. We have tennis courts and golf links and a bowling alley. Do you play tennis? And we can go out in the car whenever we like. It's going to be grand. I'll show you my dog and my pony I used to ride. He's getting old now, and I'm too big for him, but I love him just the same. I have a saddle horse, but I don't ride much. I'd rather go motoring with Sid. And so she rattled on, and the mother sighed for her little girl, who was being tempted by a new and beautiful world, and had not the wherewithal to enter it, even if it were possible for her to do so. Out in the sunset, the car was speeding back again, with the seats full, Doris chirping gleefully at the ride, for her little fat legs had grown very weary with the long walk through the meadow, and Shirley had almost been sorry she had taken her along. The boys were shouting all sorts of questions about dogs and chickens and cars and a garden, and Graham was answering them all good-humoredly, now and then turning around to throw back a pleasant sentence and a smile at the quiet girl with the happy eyes, sitting in the back seat, with her arm around her little sister. There was nothing notable about that ride to remember. It was just one of those beautiful bits of pleasantness that fit into the mosaic of any growing friendship, a bit of color, without which the whole is not perfect. Shirley's part in it was small. She said little and sat listening happily to the boys' conversation with Graham. She had settled it with her heart that morning that she and the young man on the front seat had nothing in future to do with each other. But it was pleasant to see him sitting there and talking with her brothers. There was no reason why she should not be glad for that, and glad he was not a snob, for every time she looked on his clean, frank face and saw his nice gray eyes upon her, she was surer that he was not a snob. The guests stayed a little while after they all got back, and accepted quite as a matter of course the dainty little lunch that Carol and Elizabeth, slipping away unobserved, prepared and brought in on trays. Some of the salad left over from dinner, some round rolls that Shirley had brought out with her Saturday, cut in two and crisply toasted, cups of delicious cocoa and little cakes. That was all, but it tasted fine, and the two self-invited guests enjoyed it hugely. Then they all ranged themselves around the piano and sang hymns. It is safe to say that the guests, at least, had not spent as Sabbathy a Sabbath in all their lives. Elizabeth was quite astonished when she suggested that they sing a popular song to have Carol answer in a polite but gently reproving tone, "Oh, not today, you know." "Why not? Doesn't your mother like it?" whispered Elizabeth. "Why, we don't any of us usually sing things like that on Sunday, you know. It doesn't seem like Sunday. It doesn't seem quite respectful to God." Carol was terribly embarrassed and was struggling to make her idea plain. "Oh," Elizabeth said, and stood looking wistfully, wonderingly at her friend, and finally stole out a soft hand and slipped it into Carol's, pressing her fingers as if to make her know she understood. Then they lifted up their voices again over the same hymn book. "Welcome, welcome, Sabbath morning," "though it's evening now," said Carol. "Now we rest from every care. Welcome, welcome is thy dawning, holy Sabbath, day of prayer." Graham looked about on the group as they sang, his own fine tenor joining in the words, his eyes lingering on the earnest face of his little sister as she stood arm in arm with the other girl, and was suddenly thrilled with the thought of what a Sabbath might be, kept in this way. It had never appealed to him quite like that before. Sabbath-keeping had seemed a dry, thankless task for a few fanatics. Now, a new possibility loomed vaguely in his mind. He could see that people like this could really make the Sabbath something to love, not just a day to loll through and pass the time away. When they finally went away, there was just a streak of dull red left in the western horizon where the day had disappeared, and all the air was seething with sweet night sounds and odors, the dampness of the swamps striking coolly in their faces as the car sped along. "Sidney," said Elizabeth after a long time, "did you ever feel as if God were real?" "Why, how do you mean, kid?" asked the brother, rather embarrassed. These subjects were not discussed at all in the Graham household. "Did you ever feel as if there really was a God somewhere, like a person, that could see and hear you and know what you did and how you felt to him? Because they do. Carol said they didn't sing Tipperary on Sunday because it didn't seem quite respectful to God. And I could see she really meant it. It wasn't just because her mother said she had to or anything like that. She thought so herself." Said Graham thoughtfully. "Well, they're rather remarkable people, I think." "Well, I think so too. And I think it's about time you fixed it up with Mamma to let Carol come and visit me." "I'm going to get Mother to go out there and call this week if I can," said Graham, after another longer pause, and then added, "I think she will go, and I think she will like them. After that, we'll see, kid. Don't you worry. They're nice, all right." He was thinking of the look on Shirley's face as she sat at the piano, playing for them all to sing. Chapter 14. The first few days in the new home were filled with wonder and delight for them all. They could just not get used to having plenty of room indoors, with all outdoors for a playground. Doris's cheeks took on a lovely pink, and her eyes began to sparkle. She and Harley spent all day out of doors. They were making a garden. Not that they had any experience or any utensils. There was an old hoe and a broken spade down in the basement of the barn, and with these Harley managed to remove a few square feet of young turf and mellow up an inch or so of soil depth. In this they planted violet roots and buttercups and daisies, which they found in the meadows. Doris had a corner all her own, with neat rows of tiny stones from the brook laid in elaborate baby patterns around the edge, and in this she stuck twigs and weeds of all descriptions, and was never daunted, only pained and surprised when they drooped and died in a day or two, and had to be supplanted by others. It had been decided that Harley was to stop school and stay at home with Mother and Doris, which indeed he was quite willing to do under the glamour of the new life. The school itself never had much attraction for him, and the fellers were almost forgotten in searching for angleworms and building dams in the creek. Carol went to high school every morning with Shirley and George on the trolley. There were only 6 more weeks till term was over, and it was better for Carol to finish out her year and get her credits. Shirley thought they could afford the extra car fare for just that little while, and so all day long Mother and Doris and Harley kept quiet home in the old barn, and the meadows rang with Doris's shouts and Harley's answers. One day the doctor came out in his machine to see Mrs. Hollister as he had promised to do, and found her so much better that he told her she might get up and go around a little while every day if she was very careful not to get overtired. He prophesied a speedy return to health if she kept on looking happy and breathing this good air. He praised the good sense that brought her out into the country to live, in preference to any little tucked-up house in town, and said if she could only get well enough to work outdoors in the ground and have a flower bed, it would be the making of her. Her eyes brightened at that, for she loved flowers, and in the days of her youth had been extremely successful at making things grow. The doctor was deeply interested in the barn. He walked about with his hands in his pockets, looking the rooms over, as delighted as a child at seeing a new mechanical toy. "Well, now, this is great," he said heartily. "This is simply great. I admire you people for having the nerve to go against conventionality and come out here. If I had a few more patients who could be persuaded to go out into the country and take some of the unused old barns and fix them up to live in, I'd have to change my occupation. It's a great idea, and I mean to recommend it to others if you don't mind. Only I doubt if I find 2 others who have the nerve to follow your example." The invalid laughed. "Why, doctor, I can't see the nerve. We really hadn't any choice. We couldn't find a decent place that we could afford, and this was big and healthful and cost less than the worst little tenement that would have done in town. Anyone would be a fool not to have come here. Mrs. Hollister, do you know that most people would rather starve and swelter, yes, and die in a conventional house, than to do such an unheard-of thing as to live in a barn? No matter how delightful that barn might be. You are a great little woman, Mrs. Hollister, and you deserve to get well and to see your children prosper. And they will. They have the right spirit." After his visit, Mrs. Hollister began to get up a little while every day, and her improvement in health was rapid. She even ventured out to see Doris's garden and watched the birdie in his nest in the tree. One day a drayman stopped at the place and left several great rolls of chicken wire and a couple of big crates. One crate was bigger than the other and contained 6 big yellow hens and a beautiful rooster. The small crate held 2 lovely white rabbits. The children hovered joyfully over the crates. "Mine wabbits," declared Doris solemnly. "Nice, Mr. Graham. Give Doris wabbits." "Did Mr. Graham send you some rabbits?" questioned her mother. "Yes, he did say he was going to send me some wabbits on his way from church in the big automobile. He did say he would give me wabbits. Oh, mine wabbits!" Doris was in ecstasy. Mrs. Hollister looked at the big rolls of wire questioningly. "George and I told him we wanted some chickens. I guess that's why he sent them," announced Harley excitedly. "I hope you boys didn't hint. That's very bad manners. You know I can't have Mr. Graham giving you such expensive presents. It won't do, dear." "No, Mother, we didn't hint. George just asked him if he minded if we kept chickens here, and he said no, indeed, he'd like to go into the business himself. He said he used to have a lot of his own when he was a boy, and he guessed there was lots of wire from the old chicken run around at his place yet. If there wasn't any reason why it shouldn't be in use, and he'd look it up. He said if it was, he and we'd go into business. He'd furnish the tools, and we could do the work, and maybe someday we could sell eggs and make it pay." "That's very kind of him, I'm sure, but Harley, that looks like new wire. It isn't the least bit rusted." "It's galvanized, Mother. Galvanized wire doesn't rust, don't you know that?" said Harley in a superior man's voice. Harley and Doris were wild over their pets and could do nothing all that day but hover about them. And the minute George arrived, the boys went out to see about putting up some of the wire and making a temporary abode for the creatures until they could get time to plan an elaborate chicken run. Before dark, Graham arrived. He had brought a book on chicken raising and had a good many suggestions to offer. With him in the front seat of the car rode a great golden-brown dog with a white-starred face, great affectionate eyes, and a plumy white tail. He bounded floppily out after Graham and came affably up to the door as if he understood everything. And at the sight of him the children went wild. "I brought this fellow along, thinking perhaps you'd like him to help look after things here. He's only a puppy, but he's a good breed, and I think you'll find him a splendid watchdog. You don't need to keep him, of course, if you don't want him, Mrs. Hollister, but I thought out in the country this way it might be well for you to have him on guard, at night especially. He'll be good company for the children. We've got so many of them that we want to give this one away." And what was there to do but accept him with thanks? A dog like that begging for a home, and a home like that really needing a dog. So the dog was promptly accepted as a member of the family, was named Star, and accepted the overtures of his devoted worshippers in many amiable waggings of tail and a wide puppy laugh on his face. He stayed behind most contentedly when Graham departed after a long conference with George and Harley over the chicken book, and a long discussion in the backyard as to the best place for the chicken run. He seemed to know from the start that he had come to stay, that this was his job, and he was on it for life. It must be admitted that Mrs. Hollister went to sleep that night with more content, knowing that the big, floppy, deep-voiced dog was lying across the door out in the living room. The hillside had seemed a bit lonely at night, though she had never admitted it even to herself before, and she was glad the dog had come. That night, in the little prayer that she said every night with all her children gathered around her couch in front of the fire, she added, "We thank thee, O Lord, for sending us such good, kind friends to make the world so much happier for us." A few days later, Mrs. Graham came to call. Her son did not explain to her anything about the Hollisters, nor say a word about the place where they were living. He merely remarked casually, "Mother, there are some people I'd like you to call on if you don't mind. They live out Glenside way, and I'll take you any afternoon you have time." "I really haven't much time now before we go to the shore, Sidney," she said. "Couldn't they wait till the fall when we return?" "No, Mother, I'd like you to call now. And I think you'll like them. Her, Mrs. Hollister, I mean. Can't you go this afternoon? I'll call for you with the car anywhere you say, along about 4:30 or 5 o'clock. It'll be a pleasant little drive and rest you." "Shouldn't I have to be much dressed?" asked the mother thoughtfully, "because I shouldn't have time for an elaborate toilette. I have to go to Madame's for a fitting, meet with the Red Cross committee, drop in at the hospital for a few minutes, and see Mrs. Shepherd and Mrs. Follett about our alumni anniversary banquet." "Oh, just wear something simple, Mother. They're not society people. It's you I want to show them, not your clothes." "Oh, you ridiculous boy. You're as unsophisticated as your father. Well, I'll be ready at 4:30. You may call for me then at the Century Building." Elizabeth had been loyal to her brother's commands, and had said nothing about her newfound friend, awaiting his permission. Graham earnestly discussed the pros and cons of women's suffrage with his mother during the drive out, so that she was utterly unprejudiced by any former ideas concerning the Hollisters, which was exactly what her son desired her to be. He knew that his mother was a woman of the world, and hedged about by conventions of all sorts. But he also knew her to be fair in her judgments, when once she saw a thing right, and a keen reader of character. He wanted her to see the Hollisters without the least bit of a chance to judge them beforehand. So when the car drew up in front of the old barn, Mrs. Graham was quite unprepared to have her son get out and open the car door and say, "Mother, this is the place. May I help you out?" She had been talking earnestly, and had thought he was getting out to look after something wrong about the car. Now she looked up startled. "Why, Sidney! Why, you must have made a mistake. This isn't a house. It's a barn." "This is the place, Mother. Just come right up this way." Mrs. Graham picked her way over the short green turf up to the door, and stood astonished while her son knocked. What in the world did he mean? Was this one of his jokes? Had he brought her out to see a new riding horse? That must be it, of course. He was always taking a fancy to a horse or a dog. She really hadn't the time to spare for nonsense this afternoon. But one must humor one's son once in a while. She stepped back absent-mindedly, her eyes resting on the soft greens and purples of the foliage across the meadows, her thoughts on the next paper she intended to write for the club. This incident would soon be over, and then she might pursue the even tenor of her busy way. Then the door slid back, and she became aware of something unusual in the tenseness of the moment. Looking up quickly, she saw a beautiful girl of about Elizabeth's age, with a wealth of dark wavy hair, lovely dark eyes, and vivid coloring, and by her side one of the loveliest golden-haired, blue-eyed babies she had ever seen in her life. In the wonder of the moment, she forgot that the outside of the building had been a barn, for the curtain had risen on a new setting, and here, on the very threshold, there opened before her amazed eyes a charming, home-like room. At first, she did not take in any of the details of furnishings. Everything was tastefully arranged, and the dull tones of wall and floor and ceiling, in the late afternoon light, mellowed the old furniture into its background so perfectly that the imperfections and makeshifts did not appear. It was just a place of comfort and beauty, even though the details might show shabby poverty. But her son was speaking. "Mother, this is Miss Carol Hollister, and this little girl is her sister Doris." Doris put out a fat hand and gravely laid it in the lady's kid glove, saying carefully, with shy lashes drooped sideways and blue eyes furtively searching the stranger's face, "How do do?" Then, as if she had performed her duty, she turned on her smiles and dimples with a flash, and grasping Graham's hand, said, "Now, Mr. Dwayne, come out and see my wabbits." It was evident to the mother that her son had been here before. She looked at him for an explanation, but he only said to Carol, "Is your mother able to see callers for a few minutes?" "Oh, yes," said Carol, with a glad little ring in her voice. "Mother is up in a chair this afternoon. See, the doctor says she may get up now. She is so much better." And she turned and flung out her arm toward the big easy chair where her mother sat. Mrs. Hollister arose and came forward to meet them. She was dressed in a plain little gown of cheap gray cotton, much washed and mended, but looking somehow very nice. And Carol had just finished fastening one of Shirley's sheer white fluffy collars around her neck, with a bit of a pink ribbon looped in a pretty knot. Her hair was tastefully arranged, and she looked every inch a lady as she stood to receive her unexpected guests. Graham had never seen her in any but invalid's garb before, and he stood amazed for a moment at the likeness between her and Shirley. He introduced his mother with a few words, and then yielded to Doris's eager pulling hand and went out to see the bunnies. The situation was a trifle trying for both ladies, but to the woman of the world, perhaps the more embarrassing. She hadn't a clue as to who this was she had been brought out to see. She was entirely used to dominating any situation, but for a moment she was almost confused. Mrs. Hollister, however, tactfully relieved the situation with a gentle, "Won't you sit here by the fire? It's getting a little cool this evening, don't you think?" and put her at once at her ease. Only her family would have guessed from the pink spots in her cheeks that she was at all excited over her grand guest. She took the initiative at once, leading the talk into natural channels, about the spring and its wonderful unfolding in the country, exhibited a vase with jack-in-the-pulpits, and a glass bowl full of flowers blushing blue and pink, told of the thrush that had built a nest in the elm over the door, and pointed out the view over the valley, where the sinking sun was flashing crimson from the weather vane on the little white spire of the church. She said how much they had enjoyed the sunsets since coming out here to live, taking it for granted that her visitor knew all about their circumstances and making no apologies or comments. And the visitor, being what her son called a good sport, showed no hint that she had never heard of the Hollisters before, but smiled and said just the right thing at the right moment. And somehow, neither knew just how, they got to the subject of Browning and Ibsen, and from there to women's suffrage, and when Graham returned with Carol and Harley, Doris chattering beside him, and the dog bounding in ahead, they were deep in future politics. Graham sat and listened for a while, interested to note that the quiet little woman, who had spent the last few years of her life working in a narrow, dark city kitchen, could talk as thoughtfully and sensibly as his cultured, versatile mother. The next trolley brought Shirley and George, and again the mother was amazed to find how altogether free and easy seemed to be the relation between all these young people. She gave a keen look at Shirley, and then another at her son, but saw nothing which gave her uneasiness. The girl was unconscious as a rose, and sweet and gracious to the stranger guests, as if she had been in society all her life. She slipped away at once to remove her hat, and when she came back, her hair was brushed, and she looked as fresh as a flower in her clean white ruffled blouse. The older woman could not take her eyes from her face. What a charming girl to be set among all this shabbiness! For by this time her discriminating eyes had discovered that everything, literally everything, was shabby. Who were these people, and how did they happen to get put here? The baby was ravishingly beautiful. The girls were charming, and the boys looked like splendid manly fellows. The mother was a product of culture and refinement. Not one word or action had shown that she knew her surroundings were shabby. She might have been mistress of a palace, for aught she showed of consciousness of the pitiful poverty about her. It was as if she were just dropped down for the day in a stray barn, and making a palace out of it while she stayed. Unconsciously the woman of the world lingered longer than was her wont in making calls. She liked the atmosphere, and was strangely interested by them all. "I wish you would come and see me," she said cordially, as she rose at last to go, and she said it as if she meant it, as if she lived right around the corner, and not 22 miles away, as if she really wanted her to come, and not as if this other woman lived in a barn at all. "Good old sport," commented her son in his heart as he listened. He had known she must see their worth, and yet he had been strangely afraid. Mrs. Hollister received the invitation with a flush of pleasure. "Thank you," she answered graciously, "but I'm afraid not. I seldom go anywhere any more. But I've been very glad to have this call from you. It will be a pleasure to think about. Come sometime again when you're out this way. Your son has been most kind. I cannot find words to express my thanks." "Has he?" And his mother looked questioningly at her son. "Well, I'm very glad." "Yes, and Elizabeth. She is a dear, sweet girl, and we all love her." "Revelations!" "Oh, has Elizabeth been here too? Well, I'm glad. I hope she's not been a nuisance. She's such an impulsive, erratic child. Elizabeth is quite a problem just now. She's out of school on account of her eyes, and her girl-friends, most of them being away at school, she is perfectly forlorn. I'm delighted to have her with your children. I'm sure they are charming associates for her." And her eyes rested approvingly on the sparkling Carol, in her simple school dress of brown linen, with its white collar and cuffs. There was nothing countrified about Carol. She looked dainty in the commonest raiment, and she smiled radiantly at Elizabeth's mother and won her heart. "Would you let Elizabeth stay overnight with us here sometime?" she asked shyly. "Why, surely. I presume she would be delighted. She does about as she pleases these days. I really don't see very much of her. I'm so busy this time of year, just at the end of the season, you know, and lots of committee meetings and teas and things." They stopped at the doorway to look up into the big tree, in response to the earnest solicitations of Doris, who pulled at the lady's gloved hand insistently, murmuring sweetly, "Bertie, Bertie, see my Bertie in the tree." The Hollisters stood grouped at the doorway when at last the visitors got into their car and went away. Mrs. Graham looked back at them wistfully. "What a lovely group they make," she murmured. "Now, Sidney, tell me at once who they are and why they live in a barn, and why you brought me out here. I know you had some special object. I knew the minute I saw that charming woman. Mother, you certainly are great. I thought you'd have the good sense to see what they are. Why, I haven't spent a more delightful hour in a long time than I spent talking with her. She has very original ideas, and she expresses herself well. As for the children, they are lovely. That oldest girl has a great deal of character in her face. But what are they doing in a barn, Sidney? And how did you come to know them?" And so, as they speeded out the smooth turnpike to their lovely home, Sidney Graham told his mother, as much of the story of Shirley Hollister and the old barn as he thought she would care to know, and his mother sat thoughtfully watching his handsome, enthusiastic face while he talked, and wondered. One comment she made as they swept up the beautiful drive to their luxurious country home. "Sidney, dear, they are delightful and all that, and I'm sure I'm glad to have that little girl come to see Elizabeth. But if I were you, I wouldn't go out there too often when that handsome oldest girl is at home. She's not exactly in your set, you know, charming as she is, and you wouldn't want to give her any ideas. A gentleman looks out for things like that, you know." "What has being in our set got to do with it, mother dear? Do you know any girl in our set that is better looking or has nicer manners, or a finer appreciation of nature and books? You ought to hear her talk." "Yes, Sidney, but that isn't everything. She isn't exactly—" "Mother, were you and Father when you used to have good times together?" "Now, Mother, you know you're just talking twaddle when you let that idea about our set rule your mind. Be a good sport, mother dear, and look the facts in the face. That girl is as good as any other girl I know, and you know it. She's better than most. Please admit the facts. Yet you never warned me to be careful about calling on any of the girls in our set. Do please be consistent. However, don't worry about me. I've no idea at present of paying any special attention to anybody." And he swung the car door and jumped down to help her out. Chapter 15. A man arrived one morning with a horse and a plough and several other implements of farm life of which Harley didn't know the name, and announced that Mr. Graham had sent him to plough the garden. Would Mrs. Hollister please tell him where she wanted the ground broken, and how much? He volunteered the information that he was her next neighbor, and that if he was in her place, he'd plough the south slope of the meadow, and if she wanted flower beds, a strip along the front near the road. The soil was best in those spots, and she wouldn't need so much fertilizer. Mrs. Hollister asked him how much he would charge to do it, and he said a little job like that wasn't worth talking about, that he used to rent the barn himself, and he always did a little turn for Mr. Graham whenever he needed it. He did it for Mr. Graham, and it wouldn't cost her nothing. Mrs. Hollister asked him how much he would charge to see where it would be best to have the ploughing done, and when she came in a few minutes later and dropped down on the couch to rest from her unusual fatigue, a new thought was racing through her mind. They could have a garden, a real garden with lettuce and green peas and lima beans and corn. She knew all about making them grow. She had been brought up in a little village home, where a garden was part of everyone's necessary equipment for living. She used to help her father every spring and all summer. Her own little patch always took the prize of the family. But for years she had been in the city without an inch of space. Now, however, the old fever of delight in gardening took possession of her. If she could get out and work in the ground, as the doctor had suggested, she would get well right away. And why, with Harley for help and George and Carol to work a little every evening, couldn't they raise enough on all that ground to sell some? George could take things into town early in the morning, or they could find some private families who would buy all they had to sell. It was worth thinking about anyway. She could raise flowers for sale too. She had always been a success with flowers. She had always wanted a hothouse and a chance to experiment. She heard the children say that there were old window sashes down under the barn. She would get George to bring them out and see what she could do with a cold frame or two. Violets would grow under a cold frame, and a lot of other things. Oh, if they could only just live here always, and not have to go back to the city in the fall. But of course there was no way to heat the barn in winter, and that was out of the question. Nevertheless, the idea of making some money with growing things had seized hold of her mind, and would not be entirely put by. She thought of it much, and talked of it now and then to Shirley and the other children. Shirley brought home some packages of seeds that she got at the 10-cent store, and there was great excitement planting them. Then Mr. Graham sent over a lot of seeds, both of vegetables and flowers, and some shrubs, cuttings, and bulbs, which he said were leftovers at their country house that he thought perhaps the children could use. And so before the Hollisters knew it, they were possessed of a garden, which almost in a breath lifted up its green head and began to grow. Life was very full for the Hollisters in those days, and those who went to the city for the day could hardly bear to tear themselves away from the many delights of the country. The puppy was getting bigger and wiser every day, tagging Doris and Harley wherever they went, or sitting adoringly at Mrs. Hollister's feet, always bounding out to meet the evening trolley on which George and Shirley came, and always attending them to the trolley in the morning. Out behind the barn, a tiny coop held a white hen and her 7 little downy balls of chickens. Another hen was happily ensconced in a barrel of hay, with 10 big blue duck eggs under her happy wings. And a little farther down toward the creek, a fine chicken run ended in a little roosting place for the poultry, which George had manufactured out of a packing box and some boards. The feathered family had been increased by 2 white leghorns and 3 bantams. George and Harley spent their evenings watching them and discussing the price of eggs and chickens per pound. They were all very happy. Elizabeth came out to spend Sunday as she had promised. She got up early to see the sunrise and watch the birds. She helped get breakfast and wash the dishes. Then she went with the others across the fields to the little white church in the valley to Sunday school and church. She was as hungry and eager as any of them when she came home, and joyfully helped to do the work, taking great pride in the potatoes she was allowed to warm up under careful tutelage. In the afternoon there was no more eager listener among them to the Bible story Shirley told to Doris, and the book she read aloud to them all afterward. Her voice was sweetest and clearest of them all in the hymns they sang together, and she was most eager to go with Shirley to the Christian Endeavor service. "I shouldn't wonder if Sidney wishes he were here too," she remarked dreamily that evening, as she sat before the fire on a little cushion, her chin in her hands, her eyes on the fantastic shadows in the ashes. She went to school with Carol the next morning, came home with her in the afternoon, and when her brother came for her in the evening, she was most reluctant to go home to the big, lonely, elegant house again, and she begged that Carol might come soon and see her. Friday afternoon, Elizabeth called up Mrs. Hollister. "Please, Mrs. Hollister, let Carol come and stay with me till Monday. I'm so lonesome, and Mamma says she will be so glad if you'll let her come." "Oh, my dear, that would be impossible. Carol isn't suitably dressed to make a visit, you know," answered the mother quickly, glad that she had so good an excuse for keeping her child from this venture into an alien world, about which she had so many grave doubts. But the young voice at the other end of the telephone was insistent. "Dear Mrs. Hollister, please. She doesn't need any other clothes. I've got lots of things that would fit her. She loaned me her gingham dress to garden in, and why shouldn't I loan her a dress to wear on Sunday? I've got plenty of clean middy blouses and skirts, and can fix her all out fresh for school, too, Monday morning. And if you'll just let her stay, Sidney will take us both down to her school when he goes to the office. You've got all those children there at home, and I've only myself. Sidney doesn't count, you know, for he's grown up." So, with a sigh, the mother gave her consent, and Carol found the Graham car waiting for her when she came out of school. Thus she started on her first venture into the world. It was all fairy-like, that wonderful weekend to the little girl, whose memories were full of burdens and sacrifices. The palatial home of many rooms and rich furnishings, the swarm of servants, the anticipation of every want, the wide, beautiful grounds, with all that the heart could wish in the way of beauty and amusement, the music room with the grand piano, harp, and violin lying mute most of the time, the great library with its walls lined with rare books, mostly unread, everything there to satisfy any whim, reasonable or unreasonable, and nobody using any of it much. "Not a room in the whole place as dear and cozy and homey as this," sighed Carol happily, sinking into the old denim-covered couch before the fireplace in the barn living room that Monday night after she got home. "I declare, Mother, I don't see how Elizabeth stands it. Her mother is nice, but she's hardly ever there, unless she has a swarm of people dinnering or teaing or lunching. She hardly ever has time to speak to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth doesn't seem to care much either. She almost seems to think more of that old Nurse Susan that took care of her when she was a baby than she does of her own mother. I'm so glad I was sent to you instead of to her." And Carol suddenly slipped across the room and buried her face in her mother's neck, hugging and kissing her, leaving a few bright tears on her mother's happy face. It was a wonderful relief to Mrs. Hollister to find her child unspoiled by her first experience of the world, and glad to get back to her home after all the anxiety her mother's heart had felt. Carol presently sat up and told them minutely all about her visit, the grand concert that Sidney had taken them to on Friday evening in the Academy of Music, where a world-renowned pianist was the soloist, with the great symphony orchestra, the tennis and riding Saturday morning, the luncheon at a neighboring estate, where there were 3 girls and a brother who were snobs, and hadn't at all good manners, the party in the evening that lasted so late that they didn't get to bed until long after midnight, the beautiful room they slept in, with every imaginable article for the toilette done in sterling silver with monograms, the strange Sabbath with no service in the morning, because they woke up too late, and no suggestion of anything but a holiday, except the vesper service in a cold, formal chapel that Carol had begged to go to. Just a lot of worldly music and entertaining, with a multitude of visitors for the end of it. Carol told of the beautiful dresses that Elizabeth had loaned her, a coral crepe for the concert, white with an orange sash for the luncheon, pale yellow with a black velvet girdle for the party, and a little blue silk affair and another lovely white organdy for Sunday, and all with their accompanying silk stockings and slippers and gloves and necklaces and bands for her hair. It was most wonderful to her, and as they listened, they marveled that their Carol had come back to them so gladly, and rejoiced to see her nestling in her brown linen skirt and middy blouse, close beside her mother's chair. She declared herself satisfied with her flight into the world. She might like to go again for a glimpse now and then, but she thought she would rather have Elizabeth out to Glenside. She hated to lose any of the time out here, it was so pretty. Besides, it was lonesome without them all. About that time, Shirley picked up the morning paper in her office one day to look up a matter for Mr. Barnard. Her eye happened to fall on the society column and catch the name of Sidney Graham. She glanced down the column. It was an account of a wedding in high circles in which Graham had taken the part of best man, with Miss Harriet Hale in blue tulle and white orchids as maid of honor for his partner down the aisle. She read the column hurriedly, hungrily, getting every detail, white spats, gardenia, and all, until in those few printed sentences a picture was printed indelibly upon her vision of Graham walking down the lily-garlanded aisle with the maid in blue tulle and white orchids on his arm. To make it more vivid, the lady's picture was in the paper along with Graham's, just under those of the bride and groom, and her face was both handsome and haughty. One could tell that by the tilt of her chin, the short upper lip, the cynical curve of mouth and sweep of long eyelash, the extreme effect of her dress, and the arrangement of her hair. Only a beauty could have stood that hair, and not been positively ugly. Shirley suddenly realized what she was doing, and turned over the page of the paper with a jerk that tore the sheet from top to bottom, going on with her search for the real estate column and the item she was after. All that morning her typewriter keys clicked with mad rapidity, yet her work was strangely correct and perfect. She was working under a tense strain. By noon she had herself in hand, realized what she had been doing with her vagrant thoughts, and was able to laugh at Miss Harriet Hale, whoever or whatever she was. What mattered it, Miss Harriet Hale or somebody else? What was that to Shirley Hollister? Mr. Graham was her landlord, and a kindly gentleman. He would probably continue to be that to the end of her tenancy, without regard to Miss Hale, or any other intruding miss. And what did anything else matter? She wanted nothing else of Mr. Graham but to be a kindly gentleman, whenever it was her necessity to come in his way. But, although her philosophy was on hand, and her pride was aroused, she realized just where her heart might have been tending, if it had not been for this little jolt it got, and she resolved to keep out of the gentleman's way whenever it was possible, and also, as far as she was able, to think no more about him. Keeping out of Sidney Graham's way was one thing, but making him keep out of her way was quite another matter, and Shirley realized it every time he came out to Glenside, which he did quite frequently. She could not say to him that she wished he would not come. She could not be rude to him when he came. There was no way of showing him pointedly that she was not thinking of him in any way but as her landlord, because he never showed in any way that he was expecting her to. He just happened in evening after evening, in his frank, jolly way, on one pretext or another, never staying very long, never showing her any more attention than he did her mother or Carol or the boys, not so much as he did to Doris. How was she to do anything but sit quietly and take the whole thing as a matter of course? It really was a matter to deal with in her own heart alone, and there the battle must be fought, if ever battle there was to be. Meantime, she could not but own that this frank, smiling, merry young man did bring a lot of life and pleasure into their lives, dropping in that way, and why should she not enjoy it when it came, seeing it in no wise interfered with Miss Harriet Hale's rights and prerogatives? Nevertheless, Shirley withdrew more and more into quietness whenever he came, and often slipped into the kitchen on some household pretext, until one day he boldly came out into the kitchen after her with a book he wanted her to read, and was so frank and companionable that she led the way back to the living room, and concluded it would be better in future to stay with the rest of the family. Shirley had no intention whatever of letting her heart stray out after any impossible society man. She had her work in the world, and to it she meant to stick. If there were dreams, she kept them well under lock and key, and only took them out now and then at night, when she was very tired and discouraged, and life looked hard and long and lonely on ahead. Shirley had no intention that Sidney Graham should ever have reason to think, when he married Miss Harriet Hale or someone equivalent to her, that any poor little stenographer living in a barn had at one time fancied him fond of her. No, indeed. Shirley tilted her firm little chin at the thought, and declined to ride with Graham and Elizabeth the next time they called at the office for her, on the plea that she had promised to go home in the trolley with one of the office girls. And yet the next time she saw him, he was just as pleasant, and showed no sign that she had declined his invitation. In fact, the whole basis of their acquaintance was such that she felt free to go her own way, and yet know he would be just as pleasant a friend whenever she needed one. Matters stood in this way when Graham was suddenly obliged to go west on a trip for the office, to be gone 3 or 4 weeks. Mrs. Graham and Elizabeth went to the Adirondacks for a short trip, and the people at Glenside settled down to quiet country life, broken only by a few visits from their farm neighbors and a call from the cheery, shabby pastor of the little white church in the valley. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the Enchanted Barn. Please let me know how you like this story, and make suggestions for others you'd like to hear. I'll talk to you again soon.